I hope you all have had a great week. So I have some kind of bittersweet news to say that this will be the second to last lesson I'll get to send to you guys, as my husband Derek and I are going to be moving to Texas in about 2 weeks. So I'm really gonna miss you guys. I've loved getting to teach you all, and I'm sad that we didn't get to be together in class for our final sessions, but I've got a little surprise coming you all's way in the next couple weeks, and I'll just savor this as much as I can, and you all know that you'll always be in my prayers and thoughts. So this next lesson is going to be a little bit longer because I'm not going to be able to send one in this next week with everything going on. So if this lesson is a little bit too long for you, then you can break it up in the middle and listen to about half of it this week and about half of it next week. And I will tell you at the point in the lesson where you can stop it if you're starting to lose a little bit of focus or if it's taking a little bit too long. So last week we left off with the dramatic rise of Joseph to the second in command over all of Egypt, which is one of the most powerful countries in the world at the time. We looked at his life map with a lot of downs and ups and downs and ups, and saw how God's grace was at work to lift him, and his spirit was at work in Joseph to use his gifts to bless the whole land. So the thing that got Joseph in trouble at the beginning, his being able to interpret crazy dreams, ended up getting him in this good position when he was able to interpret Pharaoh's dream with his images of 7 cows and 7 ears of corn. Joseph, through the Spirit of God, was able to know that that meant there'd be 7 years of plenty where there was tons of food. The grain was just overflowing. They had more than enough. But after those 7 years of plenty, there would be 7 years of famine where they had almost nothing. So Joseph advised Pharaoh to store up all of their food so that in the year of famine, they could use the food from the years of plenty to save up and have some for those years when the crops just weren't producing. And now Egypt did such a good job of saving up all of their food and supplies that surrounding countries and people started to come to them to purchase their food and to take it back home with them. So Egypt started to sell their supplies. Now this week we're going to have a very particular group of people come to get some food. Can you all guess who that might be? That's right, none other than Joseph's brothers. So, how do you think you would respond if you were Joseph? If the last thing you'd seen of your brothers was they threw you into this pit and then they sold you as a slave for a couple coins, really? Might not be too happy with them. But we'll find out. So you all can turn to Genesis chapter 42 and read verses 1 through 17. Okay, so did verse 6 sound familiar to you all? This was exactly what Joseph predicted in his dream. His brothers are coming and bowing down to him. But right now, they don't even know it's him. Now, we need to remember that Joseph is his father Jacob's favorite son. Jacob the trickster, the deceiver. So Joseph has a few of his own tricks up his sleeve to play with his brothers and to test them, really. So we see a little bit of justice right here. After all these years, after Joseph was thrown into the pit for doing nothing wrong, his brothers are now thrown into the pit of prison for 3 days. But unlike his brothers did to him, Joseph has mercy and he takes them out and he has a plan for them. But we see that while his brothers were in prison, they started to be transformed a little bit. Just like we've seen with other characters, when hard times started to change them and transform them. Think of our analogy with Po, the Kung Fu Panda, who was transformed into a warrior through all those different challenges. His brothers started to be changed a little bit. So in verse 21, we see they say, "We are truly guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the sorrow and anguish of his soul when he looked for us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this challenge come upon us." So we see that they are finally recognizing that they've done wrong. And it looks like they're really starting to be a little bit sorry now that they've experienced what Joseph had to go through. So let's find out what Joseph does after he lets them out of the pit. You can read chapter 42, verses 24 through 28. Okay, so what do you notice here? Joseph weeps over them. So we see that he has a lot of compassion. He has a big heart for his brothers, and he does care for them. He's not just messing with them to torture them, but he's got a bigger plan here. He's testing them somehow. And another thing that we see is, even though it's clear that Joseph puts the money back into their bag, what do his brothers say in verse 28? They say, "What has God done to us?" So this is an example of when God works through human hands. He's working through Joseph right here. And even though his brothers don't know what's going on, there is a plan. All right. So, as you can imagine, Jacob, their father, isn't too happy when they come back with this story that the ruler of Egypt has accused them of being spies and they can't return unless they bring back Benjamin. That was the one thing that Jacob wanted to avoid at all costs. He did not want to risk losing his beloved son. So he refuses to let them go back. That is until the next chapter in 43, when he starts to get hungry and they have totally run out of food. So they're in a little bit of a pickle. They need the food, but he doesn't want to send Benjamin exactly. But who comes to the rescue? None other than Judah, the brother who originally betrayed Joseph and was very selfish and just focused on money. This time he comes to the rescue. So why don't you all read chapter 43, verses 8 through 9 to see what he says. Okay, so he is acting as a guarantee for his brother. He promises that he will take care of Benjamin and that he will take the guilt on himself if he isn't able to. And he here is acting sort of as an intercessor for his family to preserve their life, to get more food, and to take the risk in order to do that. So Judah has clearly been transformed, starting by his time in the pit, through these different challenges he is having to face, in the time where he's had to wrestle with these things in his head. Okay, so when they return, Joseph gives them a nice big meal. They have this giant feast, and it's a pretty merry time. And we see that even though his brothers are very concerned about being accused of stealing the money, since they still had the money in their sack from the food, Joseph is gracious with them. And he says, "Do not fear. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks." So again, we see that God was working through Joseph's hands to act graciously for his brothers. Now, after they arrive, there is a final, well, not a final, but another very emotional greeting. Joseph sees his brother Benjamin. Now, let's read verses 29 and 30 of chapter 43 to see what this is like. Okay, so there's that phrase again, "and he lifted up his eyes." So before, we've talked about this as a phrase that kind of cues God's grace is at work. Something great is going to be happening for deliverance of the characters. And before, sometimes we've seen like miraculous big things that they see when they lift their eyes, or we see God directly working. But here again, God is working through Joseph to provide love and compassion to Benjamin. And again, this is like about the third time, Joseph weeps with feeling and emotion of seeing his long-lost brother Benjamin. So, even though we see that Joseph is full of mercy and full of compassion, and he doesn't just want to torture his brothers, he has one final test for them. All right, now, if you guys are having trouble keeping focus, you can pause the video now and you can save from here on until next week. All right. So, let's go ahead and read chapter 44, verses 1 through 13 to see what this final test is that Joseph has for his brothers. Okay, so Joseph sneakily snuck a silver cup into Benjamin's sack so that it would look like Benjamin had stolen something. Now, how do his brothers respond when they are caught back up with his servant? They make a very rash statement. They say that with whoever you find this cup, that person will die, and the rest of us will be your servants if this happens. Now, even if they felt pretty confident, this was not a smart thing to say given their circumstances. Now, as you can imagine, when they do find the cup, they are not happy. They rend their clothes, rip them, and start freaking out, basically. because they realize that they have really made a mistake here. So they've gotten themselves in another pickle, but guess who comes to the rescue again? That's right, Judah, who, as you can see, is being transformed even more into a warrior for what is right. He comes, and in verse 16, he recognizes his total guilt. He says, "What can we say unto my Lord? What can we speak? How can we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants." And then we see that he honestly tells the whole story of everything that happened in the next few verses from verse 17 through 34. Now, Judah has taken responsibility for his sin and is willing to confess. So this is a sign of true changing of the heart, true transformation in him. Now, after he summarizes this, he pleads for mercy, basically, from Joseph. How do you think Joseph is going to respond to this? All right, we can find out and read chapter 45, verses 1 through 8, and this will be the final big reading. Okay, so Joseph can't take it any longer. He bursts into tears again, showing how much he has a tender heart. And he comes out. He has the great reveal. He tells them who he really is. And at first, they're just totally shocked, don't believe it. And then they're pretty worried, very distressed. But Joseph reassures them. He says, basically, don't worry. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to save your lives by great deliverance. So it was not you that sent me here, but God. So if you all remember our little ditty from last week, it's God's Spirit is the Spirit that lifts our eyes. He is eager to surprise with the greatness of his plans and the deliverance of his hands. So I'm sure Joseph's brothers are very surprised at this point, totally shocked. But we see through all this mess, through all these fights, God has brought about deliverance, not only for Joseph, not only for Pharaoh and his family, but for all Egypt, for Israel and his family, and he has brought about reconciliation between brothers that were just fighting each other. So it may have been a bit of a windy route with lots of ups and downs, but at the end, these characters were transformed and they came to a place of reconciliation. And now we see that Joseph was crying so loudly that everybody could hear him. And Pharaoh found out that his brothers had come back, and because Joseph has such a good standing in Pharaoh's sight, he invites all of his family to come to Egypt and to live off of the riches of their land. So last couple times we've talked about how Joseph was a type of Jesus, and we mentioned how he suffered like Jesus did when he was sold into slavery, and how he was a prophet like Jesus was in being able to see and discern with heavenly vision. And this time we see that he is like Jesus in that he weeps for and loves deeply his people, his family. And out of that compassion, he acts as one person, as an intercessor that gives life to many. So, we've seen a lot of emotions and a lot of confusing things. But just like God before has worked in mysterious ways, like that master trainer, like Master Shifu trained Kung Fu Panda with those strange challenges, God, through Joseph this time, trained his brothers and worked towards reconciliation. Now, the new ditty for this week is that God's Spirit works through our fights and can always reunite us. He uses hard times to give us soft hearts and fresh starts. So, hopefully you all are encouraged by how crazy of circumstances God can work through, and how really confusing, tricky, even hopeless times are turned around for good. God is the ultimate master trainer, and unlike earthly trainers, he works all things together for good for those who love him. And that's in Romans 8, verse 28, if you want to read more about that. So, after this beautiful reunion, chapter 46, I'll just summarize it real quick. We see Jacob learns the good news of Joseph being alive. And when he learns that news, he is so excited and so enthusiastic. It says his spirit revives. And even though he's quite old, he has the strength to make the journey back to Egypt now to see Joseph. And God, on their way over, God gives Jacob a final vision and encouragement, reminding him of his promise to make a great family tree, a great nation of him. And then if you just scan through chapter 46, you see verses 8 through 28, we get a little list of that family tree or genealogy, and see how this is already starting to happen and will happen even more. All right, so thanks for listening again, whether you broke it up or did it in 2 sessions. I hope that it wasn't too hard to follow, and I'll look forward to having our final lesson in 2 weeks, and hopefully getting to see you all one more time. All right, bye guys.